The silent exodus. The message arrived during the morning shift rotation, transmitted simultaneously to every human settlement, research station, and colony ship across the 17 sectors of known space. Captain Marcus Webb stood in the command center of the Perseverance, watching the official seal of the Galactic Assembly materialize on his main screen. He knew before reading a single word that something significant had changed. The decree was formal, written in the precise language that bureaucracies across the universe seemed to favor. Humanity was to vacate all territories within the Galactic Assembly's jurisdiction within 60 standard days. Every settlement, every research outpost, every shared colony where humans lived alongside other species had to be abandoned. The document cited concerns about cultural incompatibility and philosophical divergences that threatened the stability of interstellar cooperation. There would be no appeals process, no diplomatic negotiations, no exceptions granted. Marcus read through the entire document twice, searching for loopholes or clarifications that might soften the blow. He found none. The Assembly had made their decision with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Humanity, which had spent 40 years integrating into galactic society, was being expelled like unwelcome guests who had overstayed their welcome. He expected his communication console to explode with messages. Angry protests from colony governors, desperate pleas from researchers in the middle of critical projects, or perhaps even threats from military commanders unwilling to accept such treatment. Instead, the responses that filtered through his system carried a tone of calm professionalism that surprised even him. Acknowledgement of orders received, requests for transport allocation, logistical questions about equipment disposal. It was as though humanity had been mentally preparing for this possibility all along. On the research moon of Talvex Prime, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in her xenobiology laboratory for the last time. She had spent 12 years here studying cross-species genetics, working alongside Vrin scientists whose crystalline thought processes had taught her to see patterns in ways human neurology alone never could. Together they had made breakthroughs that saved lives across multiple species, developing treatments for diseases that had plagued the Vrin for generations. Her Vrin colleague Crescital approached with movements that created soft, chiming sounds, a sign of distress in his species. He asked why she was packing so carefully, labeling every sample and organizing every data file with such precision. Sarah explained that whoever came after her would need to understand the work, to continue the research without starting from nothing. Crescital's crystalline structure flickered with confusion. His species would have destroyed everything, rather than hand over their life's work to those who had rejected them. But Sarah simply smiled and continued her meticulous documentation, writing notes in the margins of her research files to explain the intuitive leaps that had led to each discovery. Halfway across the sector, engineer David Torres supervised the shutdown of mining operations on Kelmar 4. The planet was rich in rare minerals essential for advanced technology, but its geology was treacherous. Underground water systems shifted without warning, and the rock formations contained pockets of volatile gas that could turn deadly in seconds. David had spent 8 years learning to read the subtle signs that predicted danger, developing an instinct for the planet's rhythms that kept his crews safe. The Kelthani mining director, a massive being whose 4 arms could lift equipment that required machinery for humans, watched as David trained the replacement crews. The engineer spoke slowly and clearly, demonstrating techniques that seemed simple but carried years of hard-won experience. He showed them how to listen for changes in the rock's resonance, how to recognize the smell that preceded gas pocket breaches, how to trust their instincts when instruments said everything was fine, but something felt wrong. The Kelthani director listened carefully, but they both knew that instinct couldn't be taught in a few weeks. Some knowledge only came through experience, and experience required time they no longer had. In the education district of Colony Haven 9, teacher Emma Richardson gathered her students for a final lesson. The classroom held a mixture of species, young beings whose differences in biology and cognition would have made education impossible without careful adaptation. Emma had spent 5 years developing teaching methods that worked for everyone, finding ways to explain concepts that transcended the limitations of individual species' perceptions. A young Chitauri student, her iridescent shell still soft with youth, asked why Miss Richardson was leaving. Emma knelt down to the child's level and explained as gently as possible that sometimes people had to go away, even when they didn't want to. The Chitauri child asked if the humans were angry with them. Emma felt her throat tighten but kept her voice steady. No, she said, humans weren't angry. They were sad to leave friends behind. But they understood that sometimes circumstances changed in ways nobody could control. The adult Chitauri observer in the back of the classroom watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. Her species expressed emotion through color shifts and pheromone releases that made feelings impossible to hide. She could see that Emma was genuinely sad, yet the human teacher maintained composure and kindness that seemed almost unnatural. Where was the rage that any self-respecting species would display when faced with such injustice? Where was the bitter resentment or the cutting words that would make the rejected feel justified in their anger? Across the trade routes that connected hundreds of worlds, Captain James Wu made his final delivery runs. His merchant vessel had carried goods between species for 15 years, and James prided himself on reliability. Even now, facing expulsion, he refused to leave contracts unfulfilled. He delivered medical supplies to a Zarnathi colony dealing with an outbreak, dropped off agricultural equipment to a Thanari settlement, and transported rare crystals to a Vrin research facility. Each delivery was made on time, with the usual courtesy and attention to detail that had earned him a reputation as someone who could be trusted. The Zarnathi port administrator tried to pay him extra for the medical supplies. Knowing these might be the last deliveries before supply chains were disrupted, James refused the additional payment. A deal was a deal, he explained. The fact that circumstances had changed didn't alter the terms they had agreed upon. The Zarnathi administrator stood in silence as James's ship departed, trying to reconcile the humans' integrity with the Assembly's declaration that humans were somehow incompatible with civilized society. In the administrative centers of the Galactic Assembly, Overseer Vextar of the Zeltharan Collective reviewed reports of the human evacuation with growing unease. His species had been among the strongest advocates for human expulsion, arguing that humanity's unpredictable nature and emotional decision-making posed risks to the carefully balanced political structure that maintained peace across the galaxy. Vextar had expected resistance, protests, perhaps even violence from a species known for their passionate attachment to their homes and projects. Instead, every report showed the same pattern. Humans leaving quietly, organizing their departures with remarkable efficiency, and most disturbing of all, ensuring that everything they left behind was in perfect order. They documented their systems, trained replacements, and in many cases left gifts for the alien neighbors they were being forced to abandon. On Haven 9, human families left gardening tools and seeds with notes explaining optimal planting times. On Talvex Prime, researchers left complete databases of unpublished findings that could advance xenobiology for decades. On Kelmar 4, miners left safety equipment they had purchased with their own funds, along with detailed maps of the safest extraction sites. Vextar pulled up footage from various departure points. In every recording, he saw the same thing: humans boarding transport ships with quiet dignity, taking one last look at the homes they had built, and then turning away without dramatic gestures or vengeful promises. Some were crying, yes, but even their tears were shed quietly, as though they were ashamed to burden others with their grief. One recording in particular troubled him. It showed a human engineer named Margaret Foster handing over control codes to a Zeltharan facility manager. She spent 3 hours explaining systems she had maintained for a decade, answering every question with patience despite the fact that her own species was being expelled at this manager's people's insistence. At the end of the briefing, the Zeltharan manager, clearly uncomfortable, thanked her for her thoroughness. Margaret simply nodded and wished him well before walking away. No accusations, no bitterness, no final confrontation that would have made the rejection easier to justify. As the days counted down, the scope of humanity's exodus became clear. 63 colonies being abandoned, 217 research stations closed, thousands of mixed settlements where humans had lived integrated with other species, all being peacefully vacated. The logistical coordination required was staggering, yet humanity managed it with the same quiet competence they brought to everything else. Captain Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the Perseverance as the final countdown began. His ship carried 5,000 humans, the last residents of the Outer Rim stations. Behind them, a fleet of transports stretched across the space lanes, carrying humanity toward the unexplored regions beyond the assembly's borders. Ahead lay uncertainty, worlds that might not sustain life, challenges that might prove insurmountable. Marcus opened a channel to the fleet. His message was brief. They were leaving not because they had failed, but because they had been asked to go. They carried with them their dignity, their knowledge, and their determination to build something new wherever they landed. The galaxy might not want them anymore, but that didn't diminish who they were or what they were capable of achieving. As the Perseverance's engines powered to full thrust and the ship began its journey into the unknown, Marcus took one final look at the space stations and settlements humanity was leaving behind. They glowed with lights humanity had helped install, processed air humanity had helped purify, and housed species humanity had called friends. Soon those lights would continue without human hands maintaining them. The question that nobody was asking yet was whether they would continue at all. The fleet jumped to faster than light travel, and in moments, humanity disappeared from civilized space. They left behind no threats, no sabotage, no burning bridges, just empty quarters, organized files, and the growing silence of questions that would soon demand answers. The galaxy had asked humanity to leave quietly, and humanity had obliged. What the galaxy would learn in the months to come was that sometimes the quietest departures echo the loudest. The unraveling 6 months passed like a slow exhale across the galaxy. The Galactic Assembly had expected a period of adjustment after humanity's departure, perhaps some minor disruptions that would resolve themselves as other species adapted to fill the gaps. Instead, what began as small inconveniences grew into cascading failures that threatened the very foundation of interstellar civilization. The first crisis emerged on the agricultural world of Thessar 7, where the Xanthari had cultivated crops for 3 generations alongside human farming communities. The irrigation systems that had functioned flawlessly for decades suddenly began producing erratic results. Water flooded some fields while leaving others parched. The Xanthari agricultural engineers examined every component of the network, finding no mechanical failures. The pumps worked, the sensors reported accurate data, and the distribution channels showed no blockages. A young Xanthari technician named Valkyra finally discovered the problem while reviewing historical maintenance logs. The human farmers hadn't just operated the irrigation system. They had constantly adjusted it based on factors the automated sensors couldn't measure. They had watched the color of the leaves, felt the texture of the soil, observed the behavior of native insects that indicated moisture levels. The system was designed to be managed, not just monitored, and the Xanthari had never realized how much intuitive correction the humans had been applying every single day. Valkyra tried to implement manual adjustments based on the patterns she observed in the logs, but without understanding the underlying reasoning, her attempts created more problems than they solved. Within 4 months of humanity's departure, crop yields on Thessar 7 had dropped by 40%. The Xanthari Council made the difficult decision to import food from other worlds, a humiliating admission for a species that had prided themselves on agricultural self-sufficiency. Halfway across the galaxy, the Krillian Healing Collective faced a crisis of a different nature. The Krillians were renowned medical practitioners whose biological abilities allowed them to sense disease and injury in other species with remarkable accuracy. Their healing centers had been destinations for medical emergencies across dozens of star systems. Now patients were dying from conditions that should have been easily treatable. Head healer Sixenol reviewed case files with growing horror. A Vrin patient with a routine infection had deteriorated rapidly when standard treatments failed. A Thanari child's bone fracture had healed improperly, causing permanent damage. A Kelthani worker's toxin exposure had been misdiagnosed until it was too late. The Krillian healers hadn't suddenly lost their abilities, but somehow their success rate had plummeted. The revelation came when Sixenol discovered archived medical journals written by Dr. Sarah Chen and other human researchers. Over the past 12 years, human doctors had published hundreds of papers on cross-species medicine, developing new diagnostic techniques and treatment protocols. The Krillians had read these papers, incorporated the recommendations into their practices, and assumed they understood the principles involved. What they hadn't realized was that 60% of their successful treatments in the past 5 years had been based directly on human medical innovations. More critically, the human doctors had served as translators between different medical philosophies. The Krillians approached healing through biological sensing and intuitive adjustment. The Vrin used mathematical models and crystalline resonance analysis. The Thanari relied on chemical interventions and genetic therapies. Human doctors had been the ones who synthesized these different approaches, finding ways to combine techniques that seemed incompatible. Without that synthesis, each species had reverted to their own methods, and patients with complex conditions suffered as a result. Sixnal tried to recreate the human approach by studying Dr. Chen's research in detail, but reading about synthesis was different from achieving it. The human doctors had possessed a flexibility of thinking that allowed them to shift between different conceptual frameworks, seeing connections that remained invisible to species with more rigid cognitive patterns. The Krillian Healing Collective, once the pride of galactic medicine, began referring their most difficult cases elsewhere, and even then, survival rates continued to decline. In the commercial sectors, the breakdown was even more visible. The Nexus Trade Hub, which coordinated economic activity for 37 star systems, descended into chaos within 3 months of humanity's departure. Ships arrived at wrong destinations. Cargo sat undelivered in warehouses because scheduling conflicts prevented timely pickup. Trade disputes that should have been resolved in days dragged on for weeks, disrupting supply chains across multiple sectors. The Vraxian trade coordinator Zelmoth had taken over operations from Captain James Wu, confident that managing the hub would be straightforward. The systems were automated, the procedures well documented, and the Vraxians prided themselves on logical efficiency. What Zelmoth discovered was that automation only worked when someone understood the chaos underneath. James Wu had spent 15 years building relationships with merchants from dozens of species, learning their customs and communication styles, understanding the unwritten rules that governed interspecies commerce. When a Chitauri trader said a delivery would arrive when the third moon rises, James knew that meant approximately 4 local days, but could vary by 20% depending on weather conditions. When a Kelthani merchant agreed to a deal in principle, James understood that 3 more meetings would be needed before actual commitment. When a Thanari supplier quoted a price, James knew to factor in cultural haggling that would reduce the final cost by exactly 15%. Zelmoth had none of this contextual knowledge. He took statements at face value, scheduled deliveries based on literal interpretations, and created contracts that seemed clear but violated dozens of unspoken cultural expectations. Within weeks, merchants began avoiding Nexus Hub entirely, taking their business to smaller facilities where at least the misunderstandings were less catastrophic. Trade volume dropped by 35%, and the economic ripple effects touched every system connected to the hub. The crisis extended into security and conflict resolution. The Galactic Assembly had maintained peace for decades through a complex system of mediation and diplomacy. What few species had noticed was how often humans had served as neutral mediators, in disputes where other species' cognitive biases made compromise impossible. Mediator First Class. Thornax of the Vrin Collective faced a territorial dispute between the Zenthari and the Kelthani that seemed straightforward on the surface. Both species claimed ownership of a mineral-rich asteroid field, based on ancient treaties with different interpretations. Thornax applied pure logic to the problem, analyzing the treaty language and historical precedent to determine the legally correct answer. His ruling favored the Zenthari based on precise textual analysis. The Kelthani, whose culture valued strength and direct action over legal technicalities, rejected the ruling and threatened military action. Thornax, confused by what seemed like an irrational response, doubled down on the legal argument. The situation escalated toward violence that would have shattered decades of peace. An elder Vrin diplomat finally explained the problem to Thornax. Human mediators would have approached this differently. They would have recognized that the Kelthani needed to feel their strength was acknowledged, even if the legal ruling went against them. A human mediator might have ruled for the Zenthari on the primary claim, while granting the Kelthani mining rights to a smaller but prestigious section of the field, allowing both sides to claim victory. Humans understood that justice wasn't always about being right. It was about finding solutions all parties could accept. By the time Thornax attempted to revise his ruling along these lines, the damage was done. The Kelthani had already mobilized their defense forces, and the Zenthari had called for assembly intervention. What should have been a minor dispute had become a crisis requiring military deployment, all because nobody had recognized that human mediators had been preventing such escalations hundreds of times per year. On the mining world of Kelmar 4, the situation turned deadly. 2 months after engineer David Torres's departure, a section of tunnel collapsed during a routine extraction operation, killing 8 Kelthani miners. The subsequent investigation found no mechanical failures and no violations of safety protocols. The tunnel had simply collapsed in a way that the monitoring systems hadn't predicted. Mining Director Calrex reviewed David's safety logs with increasing frustration. The human engineer had recorded dozens of instinct calls, where he had ordered operations modified or halted based on factors that weren't captured by sensor data. The smell of the rock, the sound of distant water, the feel of vibrations that were technically within safe parameters, but somehow felt wrong. David had possessed what his logs called situational awareness, an ability to integrate countless subtle signals into a coherent assessment of danger. The Kelthani were brave and strong, but their cognitive patterns favored straightforward cause and effect analysis. They trusted instruments that provided clear data. The idea that a human could walk into a tunnel, pause for a moment, and declare it unsafe based on nothing more than a feeling had seemed almost mystical to them. Now they understood that David's instincts had been based on years of experience processing information. Their instruments couldn't measure. Calrex tried to train his remaining crews to develop similar instincts, but the learning curve was measured in years and his miners were dying now. He made the agonizing decision to close the most productive mining sections, declaring them too dangerous without human supervision. Kelmar 4's mineral output dropped by 60%, creating shortages that affected manufacturing across a dozen star systems. Overseer Vextar compiled reports from every sector, watching the pattern emerge with a growing sense of dread. The galaxy wasn't just missing human labor or human expertise, it was missing something more fundamental. Humans had been the connective tissue that held incompatible systems together. The translators who made communication possible between species that thought in fundamentally different ways. The bridge builders who found common ground where logic said none existed. The Zeltheran collective had expelled humanity because human unpredictability seemed dangerous to their carefully ordered society. Now Vexistar understood that unpredictability had been humanity's greatest gift. Other species had evolved cognitive patterns optimized for their specific environments and survival needs. The Vryn thought in crystalline logic. The Kelthani processed information through frameworks of strength and hierarchy. The Zenthari understood the world through biological and agricultural metaphors. Each species was brilliant within their own paradigm, but struggled to shift between different ways of thinking. Humans apparently could shift. They could think like Vryn when working with technology, like Kelthani when assessing physical challenges, like Zenthari when managing living systems. They could hold multiple contradictory ideas simultaneously and find synthesis rather than choosing sides. In a galaxy of specialists, humans had been generalists, and the absence of that generalist perspective was causing everything to fragment. The Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session that lasted for 5 days. Representatives from 40 systems reported cascading failures in agriculture, medicine, trade, security, infrastructure, and dozens of other sectors. The debates were heated, with various factions proposing different solutions. Some argued they needed to develop new training programs to recreate human capabilities. Others suggested hiring human consultants without allowing them to settle permanently. A few voices demanded they simply adapt and accept the new limitations as the price of cultural purity. Vextar listened to the debates with growing certainty about what needed to happen. The galaxy had made a catastrophic mistake, and pretending otherwise would only make things worse. He requested permission to speak, and when the chamber finally quieted, he said words that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. The Galactic Assembly needed to find humanity and ask them to return, not as subordinates or temporary workers, but as full members of galactic society with all the rights and respect they should have received from the beginning. The question wasn't whether the galaxy needed humanity. The past 6 months had proven that beyond any doubt. The real question was whether humanity would forgive the galaxy for rejecting them, and whether they could be convinced that this time, things would be different. The Assembly voted to authorize a search expedition. Vextar volunteered to lead it, arguing that since his species had been the primary advocates for expulsion, a Zeltharan should be the one to face humanity's judgment. The vote passed, though several representatives looked at him with expressions that might have been pity. They all understood he was volunteering for what might be the greatest humiliation in Zeltharan history. As Vextar prepared his expedition, reviewing star charts of the unexplored regions where humanity had vanished, he felt something unfamiliar. The Zeltharan didn't experience emotion the way humans did, but he recognized this as what humans might call regret. The galaxy had possessed something precious and discarded it through ignorance and prejudice. Now they would have to hope that humanity's capacity for forgiveness was as remarkable as their capacity for adaptation. The expedition launched on a clear morning, 6 ships carrying diplomats, scientists, and enough supplies for a long search. As they jumped beyond the boundaries of explored space, Vextar wondered what they would find. Would they discover thriving human colonies that no longer needed the galaxy that had rejected them? Would they find scattered survivors struggling to build new lives in hostile environments? Or would they find nothing at all, humanity having disappeared into the vast darkness between stars, leaving the galaxy to slowly collapse under the weight of its own rigid thinking? The answers waited somewhere in the unexplored regions, and Vexatar knew that whatever they found would determine not just humanity's fate, but the fate of galactic civilization itself. The quiet departure had ended. Now came the reckoning.